The plains were quiet. A wide ribbon of river cut through the early morning haze. Camps dotted the banks, banners barely moving in the still air. It looks peaceful. It was not. Within hours, coal-black smoke would rise from the ground that later hymns would call sacred. Armies would collide here, kings against kings, not for glory, but for survival. And the greatest shock is this: the story often remembered as a myth was once a very real war. Welcome. This channel explores the turning points of history. Not legends told for comfort, but events where systems collided, where choices mattered, and where the world that came after was forced into a new shape. Today we move back to the Vedic age of the Indian subcontinent, to a conflict remembered as the Battle of the 10 Kings, Dasarajna. We slow down, we look closely, and we ask a harder question than usual, because this isn't just about one battle. It is about why a civilization did not fracture beyond repair. It is about why an early society built around tribes, rituals, and cattle wealth did not vanish under the weight of civil war. And it is about how power consolidated, not by chance, but through discipline, strategy, and calculated restraint. To understand this war, we have to forget the picture of ancient India as still and unchanging. The world of the Rigvedic composers was anything but calm. It was dynamic, mobile, and tense. Groups moved with herds. Loyalty was fluid. Leadership mattered, but only as long as it delivered. Tribal chiefs competed for pasture, river access, and ritual prestige. The rivers, especially the Revi and its neighbors, were lifelines. Whoever controlled them controlled movement, food, and trade. There was another pressure, less visible but constant. Identity was not yet fixed. People were known by lineage and tribe, not by kingdoms as we imagine later in Indian history. The social structure was forming, not finished. Rules around priesthood, warrior duties, and patronage were being negotiated in real time. And behind this network of ties stood ritual specialists, the rishis, who remembered, judged, and recorded. Their words gave legitimacy. Their silence took it away. Into this system walked a figure named Sudas. He was not a cartoon hero. He did not stand alone against the world. He stood at the head of a tribe, the Bharatas, supported by advisors and priests. His importance came from what he represented, a centralizing force in a landscape that resisted centralization. Sudas inherited a position that was already delicate. The Bharatas sat on valuable land. Their neighbors watched them closely. A wrong step could turn all surrounding chiefs into enemies. And that is exactly what happened. At some point, through policy insult or simple strategic threat, Sudas found himself opposed by a coalition, not one rival, many, 10 kings, according to the tradition. A loose league of tribes and chieftains came together with a single shared aim: remove Sudas and realign the balance of power. Coalitions like this are rare in early tribal politics, and when they appear, they are usually born of fear. Sudas represented change. For those around him, that change felt like a risk they could not ignore. Here comes the turning point. Most conflicts of this period were small, swift, and localized. Raids for cattle, skirmishes over honor, ritual competitions. Dasarajna was different. It gathered multiple tribal forces along the river. It forced leaders to coordinate movement, supply food to large fighting groups, and manage complex alliances. This required planning far beyond individual bravery. It was the earliest sign of organized warfare on the subcontinent at scale. Sudas had to choose how to respond. He could retreat into safe territory, preserve his tribe, and wait. That would avoid casualties but concede power. He could rush forward, trust courage, and charge head-on into superior numbers. That would satisfy pride, but risk annihilation. Instead, Sudas relied on something else: patience and preparation. He studied the river. The rivers of the Punjab are not background scenery. They shape every decision. Floods can isolate armies, mud can trap chariots, narrow banks can funnel movement. Sudas used this system like a weapon. According to the tradition, he waited until the coalition had crossed unstable ground. He struck when they were divided, vulnerable, and less able to maneuver. This was not an accident. This was logistics as strategy. The coalition, confident in numbers, expected straightforward victory. 10 kings against 1 seemed mathematically simple. But war is rarely decided by arithmetic. It is decided by coordination, supply, and timing. As the opposing forces struggled with terrain, Sudas attacked with focused force. The result was devastating, not because the enemy lacked courage, but because they lacked unity. Individual chiefs pursued separate priorities. Some wanted plunder, some wanted dominance. Some simply wanted Sudas removed. Their coalition was wide, not deep. Here is where tension truly appears. The battle itself was not just a clash of weapons, it was a clash of systems. On one side stood fragmented authority, loosely aligned but internally divided. On the other stood a tribe increasingly structured around central leadership, ritual legitimacy, and disciplined organization. The outcome of Dasarajna was not the victory of a man over 10 others. It was the victory of cohesion over disunity. There were risks even in victory. Sudas had to act carefully. Total destruction of neighboring tribes might have brought short-term security but long-term isolation. Trade networks would collapse. Ritual specialists could turn hostile. There is evidence, in the hymns attributed to this period, of restraint. The wind did not trigger indiscriminate slaughter, it triggered consolidation. Allies were absorbed, rivals were weakened but not always erased. The landscape after the war was not empty, it was reordered. The result changed the Bharata. It also changed the early Vedic world. Sudas' success created prestige. With prestige came ritual centrality. Priests connected to his lineage, most famously the figure of Vishvamitra, and his rivals gained prominence. The relationship between rulers and ritual specialists tightened. Power began to travel with sanctioned rites. Warfare and worship became connected in a feedback loop. Victory justified ritual, and ritual justified leadership. The battle also marked an early stage in the slow movement toward larger political units, not yet empires, not yet classical kingdoms, but the idea that one chief could coordinate over multiple river zones and hold authority afterward, that was new. It set a pattern that later states in the Gangetic Plains would refine to a much higher degree. And here is the deeper impact. The Battle of the 10 Kings is sometimes treated as a distant legend inside a religious text. When examined as history, however, it reveals something more important than a list of names. It shows how fragile societies stabilized, how internal conflict, instead of tearing a civilization apart, can force it to mature. After Dasarajna, the Vedic world did not collapse. It organized itself, produced new layers of hierarchy, and carried its traditions eastward over the next centuries. We tend to imagine historical change arriving with foreign invasion or technological shock. Here, the force was internal pressure, rival tribes, scarce resources, and the politics of ritual created a crucible in which leadership had to adapt or disappear. Sudas did not simply win a battle. He navigated a problem that any developing society faces: how to grow without breaking apart. That is why this war matters. It was not the largest battle in Indian history. It was not the most dramatic. But it was early, and early events have leverage. They shape expectations. They teach elites what is possible. They set precedents. The memory of 10 kings aligning and failing against one center would echo across later centuries, into stories of confederacies, alliances, and imperial consolidation. We also learn something quieter from this moment. Greatness in history is often less about individual heroism and more about decisions made under constraint. Suda's victory depended on river geography, troop management, and coalition weakness. It depended on reading terrain and patience. It depended on recognizing that timing is as powerful as strength. So when we say India's first great war, we are not describing a spectacular clash for spectacle's sake. We are describing a point of inflection, the moment when the early Vedic world turned away from endless tribal balance and toward structured dominance. A moment when coordination proved stronger than numbers. A moment when ritual and power locked together in a way that would define the subcontinent for millennia. The smoke on the riverbank eventually faded. The hymns remained, and today, standing far from those waters, we can still feel the consequence of that choice. If you found this story compelling, stay with this channel. We explore the events that changed direction, not just the ones that made noise. What battle, ruler, or forgotten turning point should we cover next? Leave your ideas in the comments. If you want more stories like this, calm, serious, and grounded, consider subscribing and sharing this video. It helps the channel continue this work. History is not just what happened, it's how decisions shaped what could happen next. And sometimes, it begins beside a quiet river, just before the world changes.